The year is 1347. The world is a different place. Europe's narrow streets, crowded markets, and noisy ports. But a dark threat lurks. A terrifying disease that appears suddenly, slowly engulfs the continent, and will destroy millions of lives. The Black Death. Today, I will tell you how this terrifying plague emerged, how it affected people, and how it upended the Middle Ages. What is the Black Death? How did it emerge? 14th century. In the heart of Europe, a darkness was rising that no one could fully comprehend. A plague, the most terrifying nightmare in history, leaving people helpless in seconds and burying cities in silence. The Black Death. So, what exactly is the Black Death? Where did it come from? How did it spread so quickly and so deadly? Varsail and Medinth. Black Death was actually a disease caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Fleas carrying this bacterium spread the disease to humans by crawling on rats. The epidemic began in 1347, spreading from remote areas of Central Asia to Europe via trade routes. So, it can be considered a global pandemic in the modern sense. But how did it spread? Why were people helpless? And how did this epidemic change the social, economic, and cultural life of Europe? We will discover the answers to all of these questions step by step. Are you ready? Rapid spread of the disease. The Black Death spread not only to a town or country, but across continents at a rapid pace. How? The trade routes and human mobility of the time were the biggest accelerators of this deadly epidemic. Without realizing it, they carried this deadly bacterium, carried by rats and fleas, to Mediterranean ports on merchant ships. The epidemic first reached the Italian port city of Genoa. Here, the disease quickly took over the city. When a ship anchored on shore, the invisible enemy it carried came along with it. People's lives changed completely from that moment on. Because this disease spread rapidly through the respiratory tract and flea bites. Consider that an infection that began with a flea bite quickly spread into the bloodstream, causing severe fever and swollen lymph nodes or buboes. This is why the disease is also known as the bubonic plague. And the disease spread like wildfire. The deathly silence rising from the streets of crowded cities took thousands of lives every day. 1/3 of Europe's population lost their lives. The incredible speed of the disease created a continent in turmoil, with people at a loss as to what to do. So how could this dark nightmare be stopped? Symptoms of the disease. Terrifying. Buboes. The most terrifying and feared symptom of the Black Death was the swelling known as buboes that formed in various parts of the body. These buboes not only caused physical pain, but also announced to everyone that the disease was deadly. These swellings usually appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck areas. These purple, black, and sometimes pus-filled blisters were a sign of the destruction caused by the infection in the lymph nodes. As the body's defense mechanism tried to fight the infection, the lymph nodes became inflamed, causing unbearable pain. Patients struggled with high fever, chills, headaches, and fatigue. Unfortunately, medical knowledge at the time was inadequate. When doctors saw these buboes, they usually understood that death was approaching. The chances of recovery were very low. Most patients lost their lives within a few days. These horrific symptoms were not only physical wounds, but also symbols of the deep, psychological scars left by the Black Death on humanity. People had to confront both the disease and the approaching death. How did the appearance of these buboes affect the spread of the epidemic? What did people do when they saw these symptoms? We will find the answers to all these questions in the next section. Is society's reaction God's wrath? When the Black Death began ravaging Europe in 1347, people were far from understanding the cause of this terrible epidemic. Science and medicine were inadequate. Knowledge was scarce. So for most, the only explanation was God's wrath. The people believed they were being punished for their sins. Churches were overflowing, and efforts to seek forgiveness from God through confession sessions and public ceremonies were increasing. Some saw the pandemic as the end of the world, a harbinger of doom. This fear pitted people against each other. Neighbors were blamed. Those who thought differently were ostracized, and witch hunts began. The fear caused by the Black Death was not only physical, but also a social crisis. People blamed each other in desperation, and some even attacked Jews, who were thought to be spreading the disease. During this period, fear combined with ignorance to produce some of the darkest moments in human history. However, amid all this chaos, humanity slowly began to understand the truth and become acquainted with science. People began to seek answers other than God's wrath. So how did society develop resistance to this tragedy? How did people try to protect themselves? We will see this in the following sections. Interesting methods in combating the pandemic. As the Black Death ravaged Europe, people were at a loss as to what to do about the deadly epidemic. Medicine was still in its infancy, and knowledge was limited, so the methods that emerged were sometimes unbelievable, sometimes tragicomic. For example, plague doctors. Do you remember those famous long-beaked masks? At the end of these masks were herbs and spices to block what they thought were bad smells and germs. Of course, this did little to prevent the disease, but it became a symbol of the helplessness of the time. Some burned incense to purify the air, while others clung to amulets and talismans that they believed would bring them luck. In some areas, there were even groups dancing and singing in the streets, believing that this would ward off the disease. Of course, quarantine was also born during those years. Patients' homes were isolated, and contact with the outside world was cut off. However, this was sometimes not enough. Lack of information, helplessness, and fear were intertwined. And of course, there were old methods such as bloodletting. It sounds strange today, but at the time, it was practiced with hope. Some also tried to heal with herbal mixtures and spells. History is full of such interesting and sometimes tragic struggles. Today, thanks to science and medicine, it is much easier to deal with epidemics. But let us not forget that the lessons taught by the Black Death are still valid. The social and economic impacts of the Black Death. The Black Death not only took human lives, but also fundamentally shook the social and economic fabric of Europe. When 1/3 of the population was wiped out, a huge void was left behind. The number of agricultural workers, artisans, and merchants declined rapidly. The labor force shrank, products could not be produced, and the economies of cities came to a standstill. In contrast, those who survived understood the value of labor. Peasants and workers began to demand their rights more forcefully. Wages rose, and social mobility began. The balance of power in society shifted. The feudal system was shaken, and peasant revolts rose. The Black Death did not only bring death, but also opened the door to a new era. As well as the economic crisis, there was also a growing psychological and social crisis. People were desperately searching for a new order. The authority of the church began to be questioned, and new ideas and movements emerged. The Black Death not only left a dark mark on history, but also became an important turning point in the shaping of modern Europe. Changes in hospitals and healthcare systems. The Black Death was not just a pandemic. It also marked the beginning of the birth and transformation of healthcare systems. Until that time, hospitals provided limited services mainly in monasteries and religious institutions. The epidemic reshaped the concept of hospitals as thousands of people needed treatment and care. Special hospitals and quarantine centers were opened in different parts of Europe to combat the epidemic. Plague doctors appeared wearing long cloaks and their famous beaked masks. These outfits were both for protection against the disease and to have a psychological effect on patients. In addition, Quarantine measures were introduced during the epidemic. People began to be isolated in hospitals and homes. These measures formed the cornerstones of modern public health. The transformation brought about by the Black Death accelerated the development of medicine and healthcare systems. Humanity learned to fight epidemics in a more conscious and organized manner. Today, thanks to hospitals and healthcare workers, we are much better protected against the terrible epidemics of the past. However, the foundations of these systems were laid during this great catastrophe centuries ago. Its impact on history and its significance today. The Black Death was one of the most devastating events not only of the 14th century, but also of human history. It changed the lives of hundreds of millions of people, leaving behind not only death, but also deep scars. It changed the social structure of Europe, paving the way for the collapse of the feudal system and the rise of the working class. It disrupted economic balances, but also brought new opportunities. It left a deep mark on art and culture. The shadow of the Black Death is still felt in literature, paintings, and even architecture. It changed the way people dealt with death and reminded them of the value of life. Today, the Black Death is studied like a textbook in the fight against epidemics. Public health practices, quarantine methods, hygiene awareness. All of these are lessons learned from this great disaster. Recent global pandemics have once again demonstrated how vital the lessons learned from the Black Death are. These lessons, drawn from the dark pages of history, are shaping our future. Although the Black Death was one of the greatest tragedies in human history, it taught us the importance of resilience, science, and the power of humanity. And today, drawing strength from the pains of the past, we are walking toward a brighter future. The Black Death is engraved in human history as one of the greatest catastrophes ever. But this dark period also left us with some very important lessons. It reminded us of humanity's resilience, the power of science, and the importance of solidarity. Today, armed with these lessons from the past, we are moving toward the future with greater awareness and strength. If you enjoyed our video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, take care of yourselves.